I am so totally into this that I wanted to continue. I forgot how fun this is to read. And my confession, this is take 2. I kind of screwed up the beat of this story, right at the end even, of this first letter, so my bad. Let's try this again. My dear Wormwood, I hope my last letter has convinced you that the trove of dullness or dryness through which your patient is going at present will not, of itself, give you his soul, but needs to be properly exploited. What forms the exploitation should take, I will now consider. In the first place, I've always found that the trove periods of the human undulation provide excellent opportunity for all sensual temptations, particularly those of sex. This may surprise you, because of course there's more physical energy and therefore more potential appetite at the peak periods. But you must remember that the powers of resistance are then also at their highest. The health and spirits which you want to use in producing lust can also, alas, be very easily used for work or play or thought or innocuous merriment. The attack has a much better chance of success when the man's whole inner world is drab and cold and empty. It also should be noted that the trove sexuality is subtly different in quality from that of the peak. Much less likely to lead to the milk and water phenomenon which the humans call being in love. Much more easily drawn into perversions. Much less contaminated by those generous and imaginative and even spiritual concomitants which often render human sexuality so disappointing. It is the same with other desires of the flesh. You are much more likely to make your man a sound drunkard by pressing drink on him as an anodyne when he is dull and weary, than by encouraging him to use it as a means of merriment among his friends when he is happy and expansive. Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasures in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are in a sense on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. At the time, or all the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research has so far not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is encourage the humans to take the pleasure which our enemy has produced, at times or in ways or in degrees, which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. It is more certain, and it is better style, to get the man's soul and give him nothing in return. That was what really gladdens our Father's heart. And the troves are the same, and the troves are the time for beginning the process. But there is an even better way of exploiting the troves. I mean, through our own patient's thoughts about it. As always, the first step is to keep knowledge out of his mind. Do not let him suspect the law of undulation. Let him assume that the first ardors of his conversion may have been expected to last, and ought to have lasted, forever, and that his present dryness is an equally permanent condition. Having once got this misconception well fixed in his mind, you may then proceed in various ways. It all depends on whether your man is of the desponding type, who can be tempted to despair, or of the wishful thinking type, who can be sure that all is well. The former type is getting rare among the humans. If your patient should happen to belong to it, everything is easy. You have only got to keep him out of the way of experienced Christians, an easy task nowadays. To direct his attention to appropriate passages in Scripture, and then to set him to work on the desperate design of recovering his old feelings by sheer willpower, and the game is ours. If he is of the more hopeful type, your job is to make him acquiesce in the present low temperature of his spirit, and gladly become content with it, persuading himself that it is not so low after all. In a week or two, you will be making him doubt whether his first days of Christianity were not perhaps a little excessive. Talk to him about moderation in all things. If you can once get him to the point of thinking that religion is all very well up to a point, then you can feel quite happy about his soul. A moderated religion is as good for us as no religion at all. And more amusing. Another possibility is that of direct attack on his faith. When you've caused him to assume that the trough is permanent, can you not persuade him that his religious phase is just going to die away like his previous phases? Of course, there is no conceivable way of getting by reason from the proposition, "I'm losing interest in this," to the proposition, "This is false," but, as I said before, it's jargon, not reason, you must rely on. The mere word phase will very likely do the trick. I assume that the creature has been through several of them before, they all have, and that he always feels superior and patronizing to the ones he has emerged from, not because he's really criticized them, but simply because they are in the past. You keep him well fed on hazy ideas of progress and development and the historical point of view, I trust, and give him lots of modern biographies to read. The people in them are always emerging from phases, aren't they? You see the idea? Keep his mind off the plain antithesis between true and false. A nice shadowy expression, "It was a phase. I've been through that." And don't forget the blessed word, adolescent. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. My dear Wormwood, I was delighted to hear from Trip Tweez that your patient has made some very desirable new acquaintances, and that you seem to have used this event in a really promising manner. I gather that the middle-aged married couple who called at his office are just the sort of people we want him to know. Rich, smart, superficially intellectual, and brightly skeptical about everything in the world. I gather they are even vaguely pacifist, not on moral grounds, but from an ingrained habit of belittling anything that concerns the great mass of their fellow men, and from a dash of purely fashionable and literary communism. This is excellent. And you seem to have made good use of all his social, sexual, and intellectual vanity. Tell me more. Did he commit himself deeply? I don't mean in words. There is a subtle play of looks and tones and laughs by which a mortal can imply that he is of the same party as those to whom he is speaking. That is the kind of betrayal you should especially encourage, because the man does not fully realize it himself, and by the time he does, you will have made withdrawal difficult. No doubt, he must very soon realize that his own faith is in direct opposition to the assumptions on which all the conversation of his new friends is based. I don't think that matters much, provided that you can persuade him to postpone any open acknowledgments of the fact, and this, with the aid of shame, pride, modesty, and vanity, will be easy to do. As long as the postponement lasts, as long as the postponement lasts, he will be in a false position. He will be silent when he ought to speak, and laugh when he ought to be silent. He will assume at first, only by his manner, but presently by his words, all sorts of cynical and skeptical attitudes which are not really his. But if you play him well, they may become his. All mortals tend to turn into the thing they're pretending to be. It's elementary. The real question is how to prepare for the enemy's counterattack. The first thing is to delay as long as possible the moment at which he realizes this new pleasure as a temptation. Since the enemy's servants have been preaching about the world as one of the great standard temptations for 2,000 years, this might seem difficult to do. But fortunately, they've said very little about it for the last few decades. In modern Christian writings, though I see much, indeed more than I like, about mammon, I see few of the old warnings about worldly vanities, of the choice of friends, and the value of time. All that your patient would probably classify as Puritanism. And may I remark in passing that the value we have given to that word is one of the really solid times of our last 100 years. By it, we rescue annually thousands of humans from temperance, chastity, and sobriety of life. Sooner or later, the real nature of his new friends must become clear to him. And then, your tactics must depend on the patient's intelligence. If he is a big enough fool, you can get him to realize the character of his friends only while they're absent. Their presence can be made to sweep away all criticism. If this succeeds, he can be induced to live, as I have known many humans to live, for quite long periods, two parallel lives. He will not only appear to be, but will actually be a different man in each of the circles he frequents. Failing this, there is a subtler and more entertaining method. He can be made to take a positive pleasure in the perception that the two sides of his life are inconsistent. This is done by exploiting his vanity. He can be taught to enjoy kneeling beside the grocer on Sunday just because he remembers that the grocer could not possibly understand the urbane and mocking world which he has inhabited on Saturday evening, and contrariwise, to enjoy the body in blasphemy over coffee with these same admirable friends all the more because he is aware of a spiritual world within him which they cannot understand. You see the idea? The worldly friends touch him on one side, and the grocer on the other, and he is the complete, balanced, complex man who sees around them all. Thus, while being permanently treacherous to at least two sets of people, he will feel instead of shame a continual undercurrent of self-satisfaction. Finally, if all else fails, you can persuade him, in defiance of conscience, to continue the new acquaintance on the grounds that he is, in sum, unspecified way, doing these people good by the mere fact of drinking their cocktails and laughing at their jokes, and to cease to do so would be priggish, intolerant, and of course, puritanical. Meanwhile, you will of course take the obvious precaution of seeing that this new development induces him to spend more than he can afford, and to neglect his work and his mother. Her jealousy and alarm, and his increasing invasiveness or rudeness, will be invaluable for the aggravation of domestic tension. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Dear Wormwood, everything is clearly going well. I am specifically glad to hear that the two new friends have now made him acquainted with their whole set. All these, as I find from the record office, are thoroughly reliable people, steady, consistent, scoffers and worldlings who, without any spectacular crimes, are progressing quietly and comfortably toward our Father's house. You speak of them being great laughers. I trust that this does not mean that you're under the impression that laughter is, as such, is always in our favor. The point is worth some attention. I divide the causes of human laughter into joy, fun, the joke proper, and flippancy. You will see the first among friends and lovers reunited on the eve of a holiday. Among adults, some pretext in the way of jokes is usually provided, but the facility with which the smallest witticisms produce laughter at such times shows that they are not the real cause. What the root cause is, we do not know. Something like it is expressed in much of that detestable art which humans call music. Something like it occurs in heaven, a meaningless acceleration in the rhythm of celestial experience, quite opaque to us. Laughter of this kind does us no good and should always be discouraged. Besides, the phenomenon is of itself disgusting, and a direct insult to the realism, dignity, and austerity of hell. Fun is closely related to joy, a sort of emotional froth arising from the play instinct. It is very little use to us. Well, sometimes it can be used, of course, to divert humans from something else which the enemy would like them to be feeling or doing. But in itself, it has wholly undesirable tendencies. It produces charity, courage, contentment, and many other evils. The joke proper. Well, this turns on sudden perception of incongruity. It is a much more promising field. I'm not thinking primarily of incident or bodily behavior, which, though much relied upon by a second-rate tempter, is often disappointing in its results. The truth is that humans are pretty clearly divided on this matter in two cases, or into two classes. There are some whom no passion is as serious as lust, and for whom the indecent story causes to produce lasciviousness precisely in so far as it becomes funny. Orwell was right. Those are a lot of words we used to be able to communicate ourselves with in the 40s. All right. Sorry. There are others in whom laughter and lust are excited at the same moment and by the same feelings. The first sort joke about sex because it gives rise to many incongruencies. The second cultivate incongruencies because they afford a pretext for talking about sex. If your man is the first type, bawdy humor will not help you. I shall never forget the hours which I wasted, hours to me of unbearable tedium, with one of my early patients, in bars, smoking rooms, before I had learned this rule. Find out which group the patient belongs to, and see if he does not find out, and see that he does not find out. Now, the real use of jokes or humor is in quite a different direction, and it is especially promising among the English, who take their sense of humor so seriously. That a deficiency in this sense is almost the only deficiency at which they could feel shame. Humor is for them the all-consoling, and mark this, all-excusing grace of life. Hence, it is invaluable as a means of destroying shame. If a man simply lets others pay for him, he is mean. If he boasts about it in a jocular manner and twists his fellows with having been scored off, he is no longer mean, but a comical fellow. Mere cowardice is shameful. Cowardice boasted of with humorous exaggerations and with grotesque gestures can be passed off as funny. Cruelty is shameful, unless the cruel man can represent it as a practical joke. 1,000 bawdy or even blasphemous jokes do not help toward a man's damnation so much as his discovery that almost everything he wants to do can be done, not only without the disapproval, but with the admiration of his fellows. If only it can get itself treated as a joke. And this temptation can be almost entirely hidden from your patient by that English seriousness about humor. Any suggestion that there might be too much of it can be represented to him as puritanical or as betraying a lack of humor. But flippancy is the best of all. In the first place, it is very economical. Only a clever human can make a real joke about virtue, or indeed about anything else. Any of them can be trained to talk as if virtue were funny. Among flippant people, the joke is always assumed to have been made. No one actually makes it, but every serious subject is discussed in a manner which implies that they have already found a ridiculous side to it. If prolonged, the habit of flippancy builds up around a man the finest armor plating against the enemy that I know. It is quite free from the dangers inherent in all or in the other sources of laughter. It is 1,000 miles away from joy. It deadens instead of sharpening the intellect, and it excites no affection between those who practice it. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. My dear Wormwood, obviously you are making excellent progress. My only fear is lest, in attempting to hurry the patient, you awaken him to his sense of his real position. For you and I, who see that position as it really is, must never forget how totally different it ought to appear to him. We know that we have introduced a change of direction in his course which is already carrying him out of his orbit around the enemy. But he must be made to imagine that all the choices which have affected this change of course are trivial and revocable. He must not be allowed to suspect that he is now, however slowly, heading right away from the sun on a line which will carry him into the cold dark of outmost space. For this reason, I am almost glad to hear that he is still a churchgoer and a communicant. I know there are dangers in this, but anything is better than that he should realize the break he has made with the first months of his Christian life. As long as he retains externally the habits of the Christian, he can still be made to think of himself as one who has accepted a few new friends and amusements, but whose spiritual state is much the same as it was 6 weeks ago. And while he thinks that, we do not have to contend with the explicit repentance of a definite, fully recognized sin, but only with his vague, though uneasy feeling that he hasn't been doing very well lately. This dim uneasiness needs careful handling. If it gets too strong, it may wake him up and spoil the whole game. On the other hand, if you suppress it entirely, which, by the by, the enemy will probably not allow you to do, we lose an element in the situation which can be turned to good account. If such a feeling is allowed to live, but not allowed to become irresistible and flower into real repentance, it has one invaluable tendency. What is it, you say? It increases the patient's reluctance to think about the enemy. All humans, at nearly all times, have some such reluctance, but when thinking of him involves facing and intensifying the whole vague cloud of half-conscious guilt, this reluctance is increased tenfold. They hate every idea that suggests him, just as men in financial embarrassment hate the very sight of a bank book. In this state, your patient will not omit, but he will increasingly dislike his religious duties. He will think about them as little as he feels he decently can beforehand, and forget them as soon as possible when they're over. A few weeks ago, you had to tempt him to unreality? You had to tempt him to unreality and inattention in his prayers? Now, you will find him opening his arms to you and almost begging you to distract his purpose and benumb his heart. He will want his prayers to be unreal, for he will dread nothing so much as effective contact with the enemy. His aim will be to let sleeping worms lie. As this condition becomes more fully established, you will be gradually freed from the tiresome business of providing pleasures as temptations. As the uneasiness and his reluctance to face it cut him off more and more from all real happiness, and as a habit renders the pleasures of vanity and excitement and flippancy at once less pleasant and harder to forego, for that is what habit fortunately does to a pleasure, you will find that anything or nothing is sufficient to attract his wandering attention. You no longer need a good book which he really likes to keep him from his prayers or his work or his sleep. A column of advertisements in yesterday's paper will do. You can make him waste his time not only in conversation he enjoys with people whom he likes, but also in conversations with those he cares nothing about, on subjects that bore him. You can make him do nothing at all for long periods. You can keep him up late at night, not roistering, but staring at a dead fire in a cold room. All the healthy and outgoing activities which we want him to avoid can be inhibited, and nothing given in return. So that at last he may say, as one of my own patients said on his arrival down here, "I now see that I spent most of my life doing neither what I ought nor what I liked." The Christians describe the enemy as one without whom nothing is strong. And nothing is very strong, strong enough to steal away a man's best years, not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it, he knows not what, and knows not why, in the gratification of curiosities so feeble that the man is only half aware of them, in drumming of fingers, and kicking of heels, and whistling tunes that he does not like, or in the long, dim labyrinth of reveries that have not even lust or ambition to give him a relish, but which, once chance association has started them, the creature is too weak and too fuddled to shake off. You will say that these are very small sins, and doubtless, like all young tempters, you are anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness. But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Murder is no better than cards, if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.